thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on the issue of Nonviolent Peaceforce and for this interview. So Mel, you conceived with David also at the 1999 Hague Appeal for Peace, a Nonviolent Peaceforce project, which was then constituted in 2002 in India. So where did the idea of such an organization come from, and what are the mission and the goals of Nonviolent Peaceforce?
The idea of Nonviolent Peaceforce, of having a team of well-trained, unarmed civilians who can protect other civilians and prevent violence, has actually been a recurrent vision. It has been a vision that was with Gandhi when he was forming the Shanti Sena, which is Sanskrit for peace army. It actually preceded Gandhi. There was a British woman by the name of Maud Royden who was organizing such a group in the late 1920s. And what we found was, far from being an idea that had originated with David Hartsoe or myself, that this has been a recurrent vision that has occurred and recurred to enough of us that in 2002, a group of 150 or so of us from 49 countries came together in India and decided that this was the time in history to put our resources, our intellect, our money, our spirits, and indeed our lives on the line to create a standing, unarmed civilian peace force. And so that's how we started. Our goal is to recruit, train, and deploy groups of unarmed civilian protectors who are invited to areas of violent conflict, and while there, work with local civil society to provide civilian protection and prevent violence. Three of the main elements of our work are, first of all, nonviolence. We only work unarmed, and we do so very effectively. Secondly, nonpartisanship. We only work on a nonpartisan basis. And thirdly, the primacy of local actors. We recognize that no one makes anyone else's peace for them. That's the job of local people. But well-trained, unarmed peacekeepers can support and protect them in doing that work.
Thank you. Nonviolent Peaceforce is an NGO that puts forward the concept of unarmed civilian peacekeeping. Could you explain this concept?
Yes, we have a series of field-tested strategies and tactics that have developed over time, especially over the last 30 years, that are particularly effective in protecting civilians in areas of violence, and also working with local civil society to set up prevention measures. Now, every community has within it many elements of their own safety and security. So much of our work is in helping those communities to realize that, to be intentional about that work, and then to augment it when that's necessary. So we employ a variety of tactics. They're all based upon having open communication with all parties to the conflict. We don't take sides, but we certainly build relationships with all parties to the conflict. So our tactics include accompaniment, where we provide unarmed bodyguards, if you will, to protect people, sometimes on a 24/7 basis. If they're vulnerable, often this includes human rights defenders, peace builders, and journalists. Another tactic we employ is proactive presence, where our teams will stay in villages or along areas that are under direct threat. So for example, we have a team today on the northern border of South Sudan in the area that's been bombed in the last few days, and we're some of the few internationals who did not evacuate, who have stayed there with the refugees who have come across the border from South Kordofan. So we'll do protection, proactive presence. At times we will interposition, meaning that our peacekeepers will interpose themselves between two conflicting parties to give them a time to cool off and back off. Another important thing that we do that is less dramatic but probably more important is to provide space, safe, neutral space for conflicting parties to come together at the grassroots and to work out their differences. We've done this a lot in South Sudan in conflicts that have arisen between the cattle herders and the farmers, the agriculturalists. Another important thing we do is monitoring. We're in Mindanao in the South Philippines. Our teams are an official part of the international monitoring team for the ceasefire agreement. And so we are in 9 locations throughout the island of Mindanao, and on a daily basis are monitoring the status of the safety of civilians.
Thank you. Today you are present in 5 countries: Sri Lanka, the Philippines, South Sudan, South Caucasus, and Guatemala. Could you talk about these different missions? What are the main challenges Nonviolent Peaceforce is facing in the field? And how do you apply on the ground the concept of unarmed civilian peacekeeping in situations of sometimes very intense conflicts?
Each of our strategies is tailored to the specific situation and is created in partnership with the local civil society organizations that invite us. And so each application looks a little bit different. For example, in Sri Lanka, where we are in the process of transitioning, during the early days, starting in 2003, we did a lot of work on accompanying mothers to camps where their children had been abducted to become child soldiers. So we would accompany mothers to those camps and retrieve the children. And then we would provide a protective presence in areas so that those children would not be re-abducted. In the Philippines, where we are part of the international monitoring team, a lot of our work is being done in conjunction with both international groups headed by the Malaysians, but more importantly with local civil society. So for example, we're working with local civil society groups to set up conflict early warning, early response mechanisms, because people on the ground know their communities, and so they can be very sensitive to signals of when violence is about to start or starting, so that then there can be mixed teams of locals and internationals who can intervene so as to prevent that violence from escalating. I should point out that in each case at least half of our peacekeepers are from the national country, and the other half are internationals who currently come from 25 different countries. Now in South Sudan, we were invited there in the run-up to the referendum, and now are staying to help to stabilize that situation. We did a lot of monitoring for violence prevention, the elections in some very remote places. We've provided space for resolutions for conflicts, and now I have a team along the northern border where about 4,000 refugees are coming from the Sudan each day. Now we completed our project in Guatemala, and that was a project where we provided one-on-one accompaniment to a unit of women human rights defenders who had been directly threatened and very graphically threatened so as to try to stop their work. And these are very brave women. And so we were asked to come. We came on a very short, on a very quick basis to provide one-on-one accompaniment to those women as they continued their work.
The best way to mitigate conflicts is to act in advance. In your project, do you also work on conflict prevention, but also post-conflict situations?
Yes, we work very much on the idea of averting or preventing violent conflict And it is for that reason that it is imperative for our teams, they are multinational teams, that they are deployed in the area preferably early on in a conflict cycle, or at a time that there is an armistice, that there is a ceasefire between the conflict parties. Because in that way, being on the ground, having those relationships that Mel was referring to with all the conflict parties, and being known by the community, we earn the trust of the communities. We also, that is actually our very best protection for ourselves. People ask us, is unarmed not dangerous? Is it not risky for your teams? And our answer is, protected are protected by the people that we are protecting. They know the local situation. They are accepting of our presence, and so therefore we feel safe in these situations to carry out the work that we do. So it's a mutual protection, you could call it.
Thank you. Do you think that all conflict situations can be solved with a non-violent method? And is non-violence working in every type of conflict? Or are there instances when a more robust approach is required?
Well, we are quite certain that unarmed civilian protection, or as we call it, unarmed civilian peacekeeping, but we don't use that term here at the United Nations in order not to confuse it with the work of DPKO. We are convinced that it is not suitable in all situations. There are, when we get an invitation from civil society organizations, we only go to conflict situations and start a project if there has been first and foremost an invitation from one or two well-rooted civil society organizations in the conflict country. When we start to consider a project, we will send a team to explore what the chances are of success, what the conflict dynamics is all about, whether we would be accepted by most, if not all, conflict parties. And so we need to ascertain that conditions of success, conditions of effectiveness actually exist. And so we go through a process of sometimes several weeks or months of appraising a project proposal. Obviously, being there on the invitation of local civil society organizations is a sine qua non for us, but we also naturally need to have at least the acquiescence, the no objection from the government of the country where we will be deployed, because we need visa for our internationals, and we need sometimes even work permits. We also will establish a legal entity in the country of the organization, so that Nonviolent Peaceforce will have a legal representation within the country where we work. But to come back to your question, it is clear to us that there are many circumstances where it is not advisable for us at this moment. For example, when there is an escalation, a very rapid escalation of violence in a country, and we haven't established those roots there yet and those relationships, then it probably would not be advisable to go in. The best way, the best time to go in is early on in the conflict cycle, before the violence escalates, and so that is what we are discussing with international organizations like UNICEF. We just had some conversations with them about countries where there is imminent violence that they know about and they would like to avert that, and so if we can go in early on, then I think we have much better chances of success.
If we go to the root of your question, violence is really the failure of the imagination. And our species has lots of failures at this. Yet, we have a default position of going back that, well, that doesn't work, so we'll go back to the gun, as if that has worked. Well, Nonviolent Peaceforce's approach is one approach. There are a variety of approaches that are based upon nonviolence, that are based upon building relationships, that are much more sustainable than to try to bring peace from the end of a gun. That can be successful in keeping people apart and at times protecting people in very acute situations. But if you look at sustainable peace, you at some point have to have that kind of work that will allow communities and different groups, different communities within the conflict area to knit together and to build relationships. That can't be done with armored personnel carriers and automatic weapons. That has to be done with people working nonviolently with each other.
Thank you. Are your activities linked to other organizations, for example, other NGOs or UN agencies?
We are working with a number of UN agencies. I mentioned UNICEF, and UNICEF is funding us in several of the countries where we have projects. And we are discussing with them ways to expand that work into more countries. And our work there is often focused on the protection of children, child protection. That is the mandate of UNICEF. And we also have some collaboration with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and they have also been funding us, and particularly in South Sudan we are working at this moment with them, and as we speak we are exploring how to expand that work in some of the areas of conflict. With regard to other non-governmental organizations, you need to know that Nonviolent Peaceforce itself is actually made up of some 60 or 70 non-governmental organizations throughout the world that make up the governance of our organization. So, as Mel was talking earlier, the convening event in Surajkund in India in 2002, we had representatives of 60, 70 different NGOs from all over the world, and we feel very much rooted in civil society because we are, in a way, an NGO of so many other NGOs.
Thank you.